think a lot of the fighters back then were just looking at it as like a one-time kind of thing. Don starts talking to him. He's like, "You got to quit, Mark. I don't want to hurt you. You got to quit."
It feels like an honest reflection on the history of the UFC, and that's what made it stand out so much more for me.
It was completely overwhelming.
A very poetic way to describe being there in person.
What's real is just like two people fighting.
Have you got a favorite fight that you could potentially maybe even write like a whole book about?
Maybe my favorite moment of all time in the UFC.
Hello and welcome to the Against the Fence podcast with your host Breezy. Today's guest, Michael Thomsen, is the author of the book Cage Kings, which takes a deep dive into the history of the UFC, right from the very beginning to what we see today. I'm going to include all of Michael's links down below for his social media. I'm also going to include a link to Audible and Amazon if you are interested in buying his book after listening to this. And I hope you guys enjoy. I've got to ask you, I was doing some research and you've written some pretty crazy things over the years. From one of them that really stood out to me was the unexpected impact of Fallout 4 on a certain adult website's traffic. I don't know if you remember doing that. I think it was back in 2014.
Oh yeah, for Forbes. Yeah. They used to send out these press releases. That I think I wrote that in like an hour or two or something. That wasn't even like, I've written way crazier stuff than that. That was just like a freebie kind of as a journalist. You know, you're like, oh, this will hit a readership, and like that. You know, I started out as a journalist writing a lot about video games, and it's kind of a recurring theme in MMA too, but like comparing video games to porn. Dana White used to do this a lot. You know, they won't carry cage fights, but they'll carry porn. He used to be very indignant about that before the UFC was back fully on cable in the early 2000s. And like still now, you know, he's sort of like when he's promoting the slap fighting stuff, you know, porn is always like in these people's back pockets. And it's sort of, you know, I was never okay with the kind of like, you know, derogation of it. I think sports is kind of on the same tier in terms of cultural legitimacy as porn. You know, they're very different disciplines in a lot of ways, but like I don't think there's some greater moral kind of good being served by, you know, American football, you know, than having sex on film to like, you know, give some other people like a little bit of like pleasure or whatever. I don't think that that's somehow this like unthinkable, immoral, you know, downgraded cultural thing relative to like, you know, cage fighting. Anyway,
is the wildest thing that you would say that you've written over the past, say, 10, 15 years? Because you spent quite a while at IGN, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, I was there full time for about 2 years. Then I moved to New York. I was in the main office in San Francisco, right outside San Francisco. And then I was a freelancer for like 3 or 4 years after I moved to New York. I don't know. I had some crazy ideas at IGN that I never actually did that were kind of I don't think the stuff at IGN was ever that wild. Like I did a lot of sex writing early on in my career too, and there's probably some crazy stuff in there. You know, I think I did a story about like sorry if this is too much, but like you can just bleep me out or plug your ears if you don't want to hear this. But I wrote a little piece about like masturbating upside down, and like I didn't realize that. Like when I almost came in my own face. It's just, I got to the moment, I'm like propped upside down against the wall kind of. I don't know why I was doing it. I just thought like okay, what'll happen? You know, maybe all the blood will go to my head and it'll feel weird or something. Like, you know, it'd be like holding your breath. There's, you know, it was just like an experiment, like bored Saturday morning. Yeah, and then I got to the moment, I'm like, so like just like a second before it kind of just like rolled out of the way. It's not that consequential or anything. It's like back in the glory days of blogging when, you know, it really was just full transparency and, you know, there was just a direct, you know, you would type as quickly as you could think kind of. There wasn't a lot of like self-editing, you know. Now things, you know, even on the blog scene, everything's kind of professionalized and sterilized in a way. And like it really, you know, there's a lot of internet content. You're just sort of like, am I even connecting with another human being right now? Or is this just sort of like, we've kind of all become like local TV newscasters in a way, just stripped down. Even the stuff that's like kind of deviant, like, I'm going to get a little saucy here and say that, Tony Ferguson was actually the best MMA fighter of all time. Like, don't get mad at me, right? It's not, but like that will seem like spicy, and like that's not, but like that's like spicy for a PR professional or something. Like that's not really in terms of like actual human experience and actual like human deviance and like the genuine strangeness of human thought. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the fun things I think of like Hanato Moicano right now or like Sean Strickland. Like they're just bizarre people.
Yeah.
And they don't self-censor and they're not, and I don't really agree with anything either of them say or whatever, but like, there's a kind of honesty about just like how perverse but broad ranging the human imagination is. Like that, like sometimes I think people have been like conditioned to strip out, and it's really kind of narrowed the media environment that we're all kind of in right now.
Yeah, and it also shows, because particularly Sean Strickland, some of the things he puts on social media, there is quite a following for that stuff as well. So there's the kind of two flip sides there, isn't there? Where there are people that are genuinely interested and have the same kind of opinions as him. And sometimes, I'd say I'm kind of a down the middle guy, it can be quite scary to see.
Yeah, totally. I mean, but like the stuff about him trying to fight people on the highway or what, like in road rage incidents, like, it's something, again, I think about a lot with the book, of like the changing kind of character of just general like violence out in the world, like on the street. I don't know what it's like in the UK, but like in the US, like when I was growing up in the 90s, it violence felt very present, like those kinds of like fist fights that like if you made the wrong turn on a street, you didn't even know what you're doing, you could have just inadvertently pissed someone off, and now you have to, like, you're in a fist fight on the side of the road with the car running, you don't even know why. The idea that like violence could just break out, that was a really very real kind of present thing. And maybe it's just I'm getting old too, so like people look at, who's trying to fight a 45-year-old like monotone like writer guy walking around just trying to get a coffee or something. But again, his talk about like being suicidal and like his depression and stuff, it's not just the stupid Trump crap, but the anti-immigrant stuff or whatever. It's like the whole kind of like, his fantasies about killing someone in the octagon, like wanting to be the first UFC fighter that like actually kind of fulfills what the original advertising line was. Like I think Campbell McLaren used to say that, like, like if you kill someone in the cage, it would be against the law, but it wouldn't be against the rules. So like, we don't want it to happen. But if it happens, well, you still win the fight then,
He's not.
That was part of the, so it's like, that's sort of, there's a through line to the way, he's just sort of taken that marketing kind of idea heart a little too much. It's like, no, that was bullshit, Sean. That was a marketing campaign. It's like, no, it's my whole identity. You just imagine a 5-year-old watching TV at like 1996 and being like, their eyes go wide and just like, oh no, it was fake. It's all, not that it was fake, but it was all, a lot of it was hyperbole.
Yeah, it was. What interested me was obviously when I was doing my research, seeing that you done a lot of, and I mean you touched on it slightly at the start of the book, but you did a lot of kind of gaming-based stuff, and then transitioned obviously to writing quite not even quite, probably the most in-depth book that I've ever read or blog or anything about the UFC. So kind of talk us through a little bit that kind of transition from reading or writing about whatever comes to mind for Forbes, for IGN, to transitioning into Cage Kings as you've produced now.
Yeah, it took a while, in part because like at the beginning I didn't think there would be value to me like writing a comprehensive history, because I wasn't a beat reporter in the MMA scene. I was covering all kinds of other subjects. So I would have felt like a little sheepish going to a publisher and being like, I'm going to write the definitive history of the UFC, like just full start to finish. Here's what happened and why and how. It's an idea like I wound up being very, very interested in, but it was just sort of like, well, that's not like why would anyone like want me to do that? So the original idea for the book, like way back when, in I think it was 2015 or something, was to just write a history of prize fighting. Because, I'd always been into fighting, from like an early age in the 80s. I kind of grew up in the golden age of boxing, where kind of before the pay-per-view wall kind of sucked all the big fights out. You could turn the TV on Saturday night on ABC in America, and it would be, a Sugar Ray Leonard fight. Maybe it was a replay from a week ago, but like you could see a lot of great fights for free on TV. And, I got very into that as a kid. And then I got into Bruce Lee, and, kind of my teenage years, I was reading Tao of Jeet Kune Do, and like, I took a big shine to that. And so when the UFC came out, I was in high school. I think I was 16. It's my junior year. And so it was just immediately like something for me. It was something new. And I've, kind of just like followed it ever since. So I thought like, a book I could do and that I'd want to do just for myself, just like a history of prize fighting. And the original idea was kind of an anthology book where each chapter would kind of tell the story of a different kind of prize fight from like 400 years of like fighting history, not just like UFC, but it would be like pro wrestling, bare knuckle boxing, gouging, which, was a kind of taboo sport in the 1800s, 1800s. And, regular boxing, in the kind of, the Ali era and the 80s era, the Sugar Ray Leonard era, that was kind of my favorite. And then through to the UFC, and that would kind of be the capstone on that. And I spent, I don't know, like 6 months or so working on that. Did like a draft of like a chapter, and then kind of, just a general sketch of like what the rest of the book would be like. I did some more thinking about it. I talked with my agent about it, and it was just sort of like, no one wants anthologies. No one reads anthologies. Publishers don't like them. Like readers don't like them. Readers want a story that's single. It feels like a textbook or homework to have like every chapter be a new kind of thing you got to learn. So I think that was more like a thing like writers would like, it's almost like a security blanket for a writer to save you from having to come up with a story. Mm-hmm. You just sort of like rely on the subject to kind of like parcel itself out, so that you don't have to do like the hard structural thinking. But I was sort of like, the next evolution of that is like, well, why don't I just tell the history of the UFC through 12 fights? So I was like preserving the anthology form, but still kind of like narrowing it down to just like a more contemporary idea. And then that was when I started talking to Simon and Schuster, and they're like, why don't you just ditch the anthology idea, just tell the straight history. And that was a little bit like Dumbo's Feather, kind of. It was sort of like the first person that had just told me, kind of like given me permission or like a validation that like, they really liked me as a writer. They really wanted to work with me. They just didn't like the anthology thing. They were just like, why? Just go write the history. Just go tell the story of the UFC. And I was like, I didn't think I could do that. But with that kind of vow or, vote of confidence, I was, I felt like, everything just clicked into place. And I was like, well, that is the simplest thing. It was just sort of more me not like fully believing like I was, capable or marketable as the person that could or should do that. And then that was just like a whole other can of worms, kind of like I was saying, like the absolute hardest part of the book was like figuring out what the story is, actually without that anthology structure to kind of just give you a default. It was just like an overwhelming amount of work to try and consolidate, 30 years of history and hundreds of different employees, thousands of fighters, and thousands of trainers and coaches, managers, family member, all like who's the characters, who says the most about what was happening at each point in time, who's the most historically significant, who has the most interesting kind of personal story. Like there's just so many different threads of stuff to kind of consider. And that like really, that took years and years of just sort of like looking at what I had and trying to, figure out what worked the best. That was the main kind of difficulty in like putting it all together.
When I was once again doing my research, I did see that you said that you wanted to write about 400 years worth of big fights or whatever. Have you got a favorite fight that you could potentially maybe even write like a whole book about?
Maybe. I don't know. I have a little bit of like PTSD about writing books now. I like just saying the word writing book. Like I just immediately imagine like not having 2 hours of sleep for like a year and a half and consecutively. And like, there's probably, I don't know if I have a favorite fight. I like one of maybe my favorite moment of all time in the UFC. And, it's ironic because I always forget which UFC this was. I think it was UFC 10, but it was a fight between Don Fry and Mark Hall.
Okay.
And Mark Hall this was kind of back when they still did the tournament. They'd taken it away for a couple events, and they started introducing the super fight on top of the tournament, and then simplifying the tournament to like 2 rounds instead of 3 or 4. But it was still like winning that tournament was kind of like climbing Mount Everest for a lot of the fighter. It was sort of, it wasn't like fully a sport yet where you would win and then just that would be a career. People just still kind of, there's an event every 3 or 4 months. Like there was it wasn't regulated. There was a lot of controversy. It wasn't clear what the future was going to be, even if you became a star out of it and won. So I think a lot of the fighters back then were just looking at it as a one-time kind of thing. Like I did it that night. I did it. I got to the top of the mountain, and then like I don't need to do anything else. And Mark Hall, I think, was one of those guys. He was an incredible athlete and a really good fighter for the time. But he was just a little bit undersized, like that was kind of the Tank Abbott era, the Don Fry era, these big, Paul Varlins and, Oleg Taktarov and like the big hulking kind of super heavy guys. And it was still open weight still. And Mark Hall had been in one other UFC. He came close. He won a fight and then he lost the second one. And he did. That's it was kind of a classical arc back then where like, good fighters, tough guys with big hearts would like get close. And then just, Pat Smith did this for a while too. He's like, I know why I failed. I could like, just got to fix a few things and then I can get all the way to the top of the summit the next time. And it never worked out. The guys that fell short of the summit, they just kept getting further and further away from it each subsequent time. And that kind of happened with Mark Hall. He came back for this second tournament and he got matched up against Don Fry, and Don Fry was just bigger than him. He was stronger than him. He was a better boxer than him. And so just immediately, it's not a very eventful fight. It's kind of a sad, slow fight, but he gets him down. Don Fry gets him down, and this is back before wall walking. So you get the guy pinned against the fence and you just like hammer on him against the fence and they'd be trapped. And he has Mark Hall just like trapped against the fence for, minute, like 4 or 5 minutes. And you can just hear, it's like sickening, the blow. Like he's not really punching his face because Don liked him. He was like, he didn't want to hurt him. He's kind of saying this. He's just hammering his ribs, and you see his ribs just slowly turn purple and glossy and red. And it's just going on and on. You can tell it's over. He's just lost. He's like, and he's not going to, even if he somehow won or something, like he wouldn't be able to win another fight in the tournament. He'd taken so much damage. And Don starts talking to him. He's like, you got to quit, Mark. I don't want to hurt you. You got to quit. And it's all kind of like bleeding through on the camera, and it's like cameras right in there, and it's just like this intense, intimate thing. And like Mark Hall, like I still get goosebumps thinking about it because it's just like the purest expression of MMA to me. Like Mark just looks up at him. He's like, I can't quit, Don. I can't quit. And so he just accepts the pain. He's just like, I'm not like, if you can kick my ass, then I have to take that. But like I'm not breaking. I'm not gonna lose. I won't like you're not gonna get me to say I quit. Like if you're gonna beat me, you're gonna have to beat me
Mm,
all the way. I think eventually his corner throws in the towel, or McCarthy steps in finally after it's just been
mm,
2 months. But like that moment to me is just like the purest thing in all of MMA and all of cage fighting. And like the thing I respect most about it, it's not really like the achievement of winning, but like it's people that find something in themselves. They find a point in themselves where they won't break to the pain. And even in a losing effort, like I think that's the most valuable thing in all of martial arts. And it's not about who you are at your best, the GSP kind of like perfect, like absolute lowest risk kind of like options, and like take the least amount of damage. The martial art, it was always about who you are at your worst. You've had a
mm,
few drinks and you get jumped by four people in a back alley, and maybe one has a weapon. It's about who you are at your darkest, when you have the fewest amount of, the guys are all bigger than you. Like, what can you do for yourself then, when like it's not a fair fight, when it's not an even match? Like,
mm.
and that's, those are the moments when like spirit, your fighting heart, your and like intelligence and technique, all these things kind of braid together. But I mean, it's also horrifying to see that, the reality of that, because it really, it's just like horrible. Like the sound of punching, the actual damage, you can see the body just literally changing in real time, second after second. And you can see the reaction that like Fry is having. He's like, you can see the guilt, like he doesn't want to hurt him. I think Ryan Hall talks about this. I think it was one of his seminar videos, but there's a line you have to cross in your own mind, even just doing jujitsu, about how hard you crank on a submission, like an armbar.
Mm.
Because even just, as a white belt, like there's a point where the elbow snaps, right? You can hear it, you can
Mhm.
feel it. And for beginning students or people that like are maybe just there for fun and learning, like they're part of your mind kind of realizes, oh, like this is also for hurting. And now I'm like, but that's part of the deal, right? Like that's part of how you get better, is you have to be serious about the risk of that pain with your opponent to get them to like develop a better response, better defense, better anticipation, like better concept of the stakes or whatever. So like there is that like intimacy where like they have to give each other that kind of pain in order to like rise up. But like there is still that like compassion where it's like, I don't want to be fighting you, I don't want to
Mm.
hurt you, don't make me hurt you. Like, you can't win this. Like, he's saying it like, Mark, you can't win this, don't make me, like, and it's just like, that kind of stuff is powerful to me. I mean,
Yeah.
that's kind of what I tried to write about with Nick Diaz, because it's what I respect so much about his entire approach to MMA, because he was really that kind of fighter too. He was, you know, you know, he was all about like seeing who he was,
Hmm.
in the worst case scenario, not in the best case scenarios, but like when everything else falls apart, like what can you really do for yourself? I think that approach to MMA is always going to be like, it just cuts through everything else about the sport, the sporting nature of it, the rankings, all that kind of stuff. It's what produces those moments of like Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor, where it's like, oh, they're still fighters. It's not actually a sport. The rankings aren't, they're like their own kind of fiction. The belts are fictions. Like what's real is just like two people fighting. And
Yeah.
like that's a wild thing, no matter how much like narrative kind of assumptions you bring in about, well, he's the best in the world and he's such a good jabber and he's such a good leg kicker or whatever. And it's like, it doesn't matter. It's two bodies, and like there's something wild and completely unpredictable that is always going to come out of that, or can.
Yeah. That
So
bit you said about Ryan Hall saying about something changing,
yeah,
it made me think instantly of the section where you're the you talk about Ronda Rousey, and
yeah,
she fought Misha Tate and she didn't tap,
She
And then
didn't
ever
hold
since
the
then,
bar.
she
Yeah.
promised herself that she would do it, and look where it took her.
She became famous for that. That was her, it was her pro wrestling move, is like those bent backward arms, those
Mm.
like, and the commentators howling on the commentary, like, oh, I can't look. No, it's gross. She's got a tap. Oh.
Yeah, yeah.
Like that whole thing that created the public kind of like persona around her. It created that like storm of like, it was the same with like Mike Tyson knockouts. This
Mm.
whole like it's almost like supernatural. You're like this person knows like wizardry things or something, but like they're horrifying.
That's what I thought the first time I saw someone do a twister. I was like, "What the hell?"
Yeah, that's the thing about it. Yeah, I don't know, like I don't train at all. I've done it in the past, that just enough to kind of like feel it a bit, but like I mean there's a reality to even the simplest like jujitsu thing,
Mm.
like I still remember my very very first class, like a long time ago, just in jujitsu. I thought I might have to tap to the top pressure because I remember my like I couldn't lift my diaphragm to breathe, and there was about 10 seconds there where I'm like, I'm not sure I'm getting oxygen. I may go unconscious just from this guy compressing my diaphragm, for because he's just so good and heavy at like getting the shoulder right in the right place, and you have a real smothering kind of person on top of you. It like, he wasn't like, I wasn't going to like go out, but like not being familiar with it, like, it's just like, there's a whole separate physical reality to positions you'll get into in
Mm.
grappling that, it's an education. It's an eye opener if you haven't felt it.
Yeah. I wanted to touch on. There's one section, I think it was in chapter 7, and it like really kind of resonated with me, and it was the way that you had written something, and I wanted to read it to you and see if you remember writing it, and then also I'll try and understand what you were thinking at the time. So bear with me,
Okay.
because it's not a massive part, but it's just the way you described it. You wrote, just as casinos bathe gamblers in the glimmering possibility of jackpots going off in every direction, the UFC fighters lived on a kind of hopefulness that they might one day be transformed into millionaires or moguls, even as they competed for wages that, in the worst cases, averaged out to less than the federal minimum wage over the course of the year. And whilst most didn't make it any further than the average gambler who found an open seat at a casino table, there was something affirming about being in the same room where people's lives truly were transformed with the roll of a dice. The chance to walk out into the hysteria of a full arena, to the sound system that turned a favourite song into a pulsing quake in the air, while 10,000 faces hung in the neon twirl of the house lights made it seem, for a few sweet moments, that as if life had become a scene in a TV show someone else was watching, and the eerie clarity of the octagon so brightly lit, even one's shadows disappeared inside, leaving only a body poised to collide against another human, dice tumbling along the octagon fence.
Yeah, that's not bad, huh?
Like it's like when I heard it, I was like, because I drive a lot, so the way for me to kind of digest this book was to do it on Audible.
Oh,
And
good.
it
So you're
really,
Patrick. Yeah.
yeah, it really kind of resonated with me as like a very poetic way to describe being there in person. I know Dana says a hell of
Yeah.
a lot. You've got to go, you've got to
Yeah.
see it, and I've been and I've seen it, and that really kind of painted that
Yeah.
picture of me being there.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of the appeal. I think, I don't know if UFC people would articulate it like that, but I think, they would certainly say that like, that, it's like being in the big leagues now. You're in the big
Mm,
leagues. And so that's part of the gratification that I think in a lot of fighters' minds will justify like fighting on a 10 and 10 contract.
mm-hmm.
It's like, it's like, because you're like, well, I'm not going to be at 10 and 10 forever, because I'm going to knock all these people out. And then next year they're going to put me on 50 and 50, and then it'll be 250 and two, like, and that's what the UFC will tell you too. It's like, hey, if you win, if you start making noise on social media, if you start bringing eyeballs in, they can track all this stuff, especially now through like Ari's kind of famous research division that just has all these sort of metrics for like, which person draws the most
Mm,
eyeballs and Q rating and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's a big part of it. It's like, like people look at their paychecks and, or fighters look at their paychecks and they're like, this is just temporary. Like the even, you know, the next one's going to be even bigger and the one after that's going to be even bigger. You don't think about like, I believe it's still even today, the UFC contracts are structured around, I think they call them escalator clauses.
Mm,
But if you do a 6 fight deal and so like if you win a fight, your pay scale goes up
yeah.
for the next fight to 12 and 12. You start at 10 and 10,
Hmm.
let's say you go up to 12 and 12, then you go up to 14 and 14. You get 3 straight wins and you're at for your next fight, then you're going to go fight at 16 and
Hmm.
16. If you lose that fourth fight, your fifth fight, you'll go all the way back down again to 10 and 10. After one loss, with 3 consecutive wins, you're now at 3 and 1, but you're still right back where you started again. It's a very sort of like casino mentality,
Hmm.
and and we kind of tried to play around a little bit with kind of that in terms of what was happening to Nate Diaz after his Benson Henderson fight, where he had this big contract that he thought like,
Hmm.
this is, yeah, I'm going to become the champion, no one's going to beat me, and he made a lot of money for the Benson Henderson fight for the time and for what he had been making. But then he lost, and he wasn't making that 500,000 anymore. He was back to making, I think it was 14 and 14 or 16 and 16. After 10 years in the sport and after
Mm,
having headlined some of the biggest UFC on Fox events, I think the Benson Henderson fight was, I think, the second highest rated UFC on Fox at
hmm.
the time. It's definitely bigger than any of the audiences they get now for like UFC on ESPN or UFC on ABC. I think it was 2 or 3 million concurrent viewers all
Mm,
at once. And yeah, like you can have a fighter like that with that appeal, and because they lose one fight, they tumble all the way back down. It's kind of like a craps table or something. And
yeah.
you know, I grew up in California, so like Vegas was always like very present. Like, California is filled with tribal casinos.
Mm,
So, I spent a lot of time in tribal casinos. I don't really gamble, but like I like going to them. And then I did spend a lot of time going to Vegas as a young person, like just, to drink mainly, like gambled a little bit, but like it was just, a fun, weird place to be and, just go drink on the streets there as a young person, go to a pool or something. And so like that was something I really wanted to kind of like weave into the fabric of the book is the casino
hmm.
culture, the feeling of it. Like there is something really genuinely comforting about that void of the casino where there's
Yeah.
just the right amount of stimulation and like you're just losing. Even the cheap stuff is like it's like $2 more than you would pay for it normally, like a candy bar or like a can of beer or whatever. But like it's just sort of like there's something promising about being in the atmosphere and seeing like all these other like people with money, big
Mhm.
stacks of chips, and like you see the losers, but you see like that one winner every 50 people, and you're like, that's you know it is
Yeah.
there if you can find the path to like get that kind of payout. If you just study right, then you can like make the right sports bet or learn the numbers at blackjack well enough to kind of
Hmm.
know what you're doing. And it's inspiring.
Mm,
Success inspires people. People like are attracted to wealth, and like a part of your mind will just always kind of start thinking about like how would that work for me if I became you know
yeah.
a gambler, a pro gambler, a rich guy, or something like that.
Yeah. It's quite ironic as well because of the background of the Fertitas and the way that they kind of had
Yeah,
this casino empire, and then to follow in with that as well. It just yeah, it poises itself really well.
yeah, I think that's a huge part of how they structured the business too. You look at like they brought
Yeah.
a lot of people in from the gaming world. Like Lawrence Epstein, who I don't know what his title is now. He's the main lawyer for the UFC. I think he's chief operating officer, maybe, or
Yeah.
something along those lines. But he was an outside counsel for the Fertitta brothers for station casinos, and he had also done some work in boxing. I think he did outside work for Top Rank in the 90s. I'm not sure. I have to check my notes actually, but like he had done legal work in boxing before he came to the UFC. Mike Murch came from the Nevada State Attorney General's office. They brought a lot of people from outside, a lot of people from the casino world specifically in to kind of set up this back end side of the business in terms of like raising capital and using debt to finance, more dividend payments, getting other people to pay for your development, and then just you taking big chunks. A lot of that was sort of like casino logic, and a lot of the same logic for the you eat what you kill kind of stuff. That's a very casino kind of mentality. So like, I mean, the idea of like fighters unionizing it, I think to them it sounds as crazy as like blackjack gamblers unionizing, saying like, well, hey, we're losing money here, so you can make a profit. So you should give us a kickback. You should give us some like vig or something, just the same way that poker dealer takes a coin out of the pot. We should all get $1 back or $1 rebate or something like that. And that's like, the the craziness of like that idea to a casino is like, no, I don't owe you anything. Like, you want money, go win money, win your hand. That's how you want money. Like, I hear that always when they talk about eating what you kill or whatever. And it's not really what they mean, right? What they really mean is that they eat what the fighters kill, and then the fighters eat after the executives eat. The fighters kill for the executives, and then if there's some like remnant bone or scrap left over, then the fighters will eat like the stray dog at the edge of the village or something like that. That's a very I think a loaded and pretty fake kind of mantra that they've adopted. I never fully understood why people just absorbed it.
Mm. I wanted to speak a little bit because he's such a prominent character in the whole of the book was Dana White. Did you ever get the chance to actually sit down with him? No?
No. Yeah,
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, we came close. The UFC was cooperating for a while. I went to the office at some point. I had a meeting with their communications person, and I interviewed Lawrence Epstein and Mark Ratner. And I think it was about 6 months there. We were just constantly, we had a bunch of interviews scheduled with Dana. I kept that, like, they put it on the books, so, like, you're going to go meet. I even flew to Vegas one time. Like, it just sort of collapsed at the last minute, and I was like, well, I'm here now. So great. But yeah, it just kept, falling through. I don't know why, whether it was just, an honest kind of logistical mix up, or if they just got cold feet eventually and just didn't want to participate any further. But yeah, I never got to talk to them. There's a lot of unresolved kind of storylines in the book. I think that any kind of history book is sort of like that, especially one that's kind of like living. There's more to say about Dana than I think I was able to get in the book, but I don't think there's more I could say about Dana without having spent time with him and gone even further. And the Fertittas too, actually. I mean, the Fertittas are Dana. Like, there's a reason everyone talks about Dana instead of the Fertitta, right? Dana, yeah. That's exactly why, he's kind of the shiny distraction over here when like the real thing's going on down there. But the Fertittas are, mostly Lorenzo, I think. I think my sense from, having worked on the book was Frank wasn't as involved as Lorenzo. And I think Lorenzo wasn't actually all that involved for a long time either. He was sort of like in and out. They really did just like let Dana kind of tinker. Is my understanding. And they were just sort of like, observing him and, offering advice and consultation and obviously funding the whole thing. But I think the real intense involvement happened a little bit later. But yeah, I think the Fertittas are the really interesting character, even more so than Dana. I like, Dana is a lightning rod, but I don't think he's that complicated a person.
Hmm.
It's my intuit having just basked in him for
Yeah.
5 years, listened to every single second of interviews he's ever given, like read every profile, just talked to a bunch of people who knew him at various points in time.
Yeah.
Um, some pre UFC,
Well,
I like,
McLaren, Mr. McLaren, did you speak to him in person? Because it come across in the book as
yeah,
if you did.
I have spoke for the book. We did a phone interview. I think we met once in person since then. I actually interviewed him for another story that I was working on that got killed. Unfortunately, it's then I think I might just throw it out on
Mm.
a blog or something because I think it's an interesting story. I met him in person for that. We did like a lunch interview. Campbell knows Dana. Before he started Combate, he went
Hmm.
to Dana. It was a very Las Vegas kind of thing, and just said, I'm not trying to hurt your company. It was almost like asking for permission to like do business, going to like
Yeah.
a mafia don or something and say, so we're launching this company. It's kind of the same thing, but like the way Campbell describes it, at least he got sort of like the blessing from Dana and the Fertitta. Well, not like they're cheering him on or whatever, but it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, nothing personal. Go do what you got to do.
Hmm.
Best wishes, but we hope we kick your ass and you go bankrupt later on. But yeah, like I spoke to a guy called Tommy Rojas, who was an early fighter manager at AKA, and he was a martial artist himself. He trained there originally, um, it's one of the back in the really colorful days. It's just to give you a sense of just like really how informal and kind of just you know from the ground up this whole culture was built.
Yeah.
Like most people, even back in the 90s, like they didn't have agents, they didn't have managers. It was sort of like, and this is how Tommy Rojas became a manager. It was like he was just the guy in the gym. It was like at Pride's calling, they have an event. They're looking for fighters to book for this event,
Mm.
and they wanted to book Bobby Southworth, I think. Tommy was just, okay, let me get my manager for you real quick. And they just pulled him off the mat and like, here's my manager. And I don't think it was legal for fighters to represent themselves. Like they had to have someone
Yeah.
acting as an outside kind of representative. So I think that happened a lot. I mean, Cesar Gracie talked about that a lot. He was just like, well, like I'm already taking, 8 or 10% as your trainer. You're going to pay some other manager who's going to screw you over another 10%. I'll do both jobs for 15, you'll save 5%. It's very,
Hmm.
it's a, and I think that's how a lot of people like that wound up being like what AKA did with Zinkin. It was kind of their in-house talent management
Hmm.
company. It was mainly about booking sponsorships to get on fighters, backs. But like Tommy knew Dana from before the acquisition. He knew Dana from Dana being a manager and
Yeah.
managing Tito Ortiz. Spoke to John Lewis, which was fascinating in a lot of ways. I think there's probably more to be said about those early days before the acquisition, with John Lewis and Dana and Frank and Lorenzo all training together at John Lewis's academy.
Hmm.
Um, Dana, both Dana and Lorenzo have kind of made very, very vague references to them discussing getting into fighting, maybe doing something with boxing before the UFC.
Hmm.
John says John went on to run, what do you call it? Oh my God, totally blank. WFA, which was, it's where Quentin Jackson came from.
Yeah.
It was a very short lived kind of Vegas promotion that was, but he told me, and he's repeated it in other formats since, in other appearances, that Frank offered him to buy his fighting promotion before the UFC started. So, and if you've read Chuck Liddell's memoir, Chuck Liddell says that Dana had agreed to be the president of WFA before the before the UFC acquisition. He gave that up to go run the UFC. So I don't know if that's true, but I think that, there was probably a lot of just sort of like ideation and kind of spitballing and making plans and kind of like imagining different sorts of things going on there. And I think there's probably a more interesting and fuller kind of story to tell about like what exactly they were imagining. I think there's a world where the Fertittas and Dana White get into MMA even if the UFC went bankrupt and disappeared and they didn't end up buying it. I think there's a lot of, sometimes like a lot of fatalism about like, oh, we saved the UFC or whatever, and it changed culture forever. And it's sort of like, the culture was already there that like, the early UFCs had already planted that seed in people's head, and like, it just, things are always cyclical. You get excited about something, you burn out on it, and then a new generation gets excited and they burn out. And another generation, it's just sort of like kind of the cyclical kind of nature of things. But there were so many promotions, even 99, 2000, King of the Cage, IFC, like there's just a million different promotions all over the country. And none of them were as big as the UFC outside of like Pride, but like the UFC wasn't that big to start either. It kind of snowballed very quickly. It went from like 75,000 pay-per-view buys to 300,000 pay-per-view buys in like a year and a half or something like that. But there's no reason to think that couldn't have happened again with Chuck Liddell. I mean, if Chuck Liddell was a King of the Cage fighter instead of a UFC fighter, or if he kind of made a name for himself in Japan and then some American promoter like Monty Cox signed him to go, fight Pat Miletich or something, and he had some, there's a lot of different ways that the sport would still be a part of culture. I think that's an interesting bit of history that could probably have some more. We'll learn more about as there's a lot of dark corners in the UFC's past still that will keep coming out, and I hope other people keep sort of following this. I've got some things I'm tracking to for potential stories. The history of this thing, it really is kind of a communal effort. It's like all history. People just add to this communal information pool, and year by year and book by book, or essay by essay, story by story, we slowly kind of like fill in a better, deeper kind of understanding about what this all was, how it all happened. But yeah, I think that the biggest mystery there is still kind of the Fertittas, and for better or worse, Dana just is who he is. And the one thing I got out of my reporting for this whole book, from talking to people that knew him before and after, and he's he is who he is. Like the good parts that you can kind of see on camera are real, and the bad parts are real too. The temper, the hostility, so yeah.
It interests me because I don't know if you've seen it, but over in the UK we've got something called BT Sports, which is now TNT Sports, and I think last week they released something called The Rise and Rise of the UFC, and I watched it, and I had a bit of a sour taste in my mouth because I've just read your book, or listened to your book, and obviously this book is in a hell of a lot more detail, and it feels a lot less restricted. I think that's the key thing in it, is that what they produced on there feels like it was produced by the UFC, whereas this book feels like an honest reflection on the history of the UFC, and that's what made it stand out so much more for me. Did you have any kind of, after the book was released, did you have any kind of like not repercussions, but anything from the UFC saying they weren't happy or anything like that, or silence?
Yeah, no, it was silence.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't heard anything, and I mean, like, if there's anything wrong with the book, if there's anything that's inaccurate, like I want to know. Like I'm not trying to write like a Kitty Kelly book here. She was people remember her. She was this like gossipy tell-all kind of unauthorized biography of Princess Diana and all this stuff in the 80s and 90s. I want to be fair and truthful. And so if there's something we had the paperback of the book come out, and there was, I think, I don't know, 10 corrections we had to make about his pay-per-view numbers. It's little dates I got wrong.
Okay.
It was the 7th, not the 8th. One of the interesting things we changed there's originally, and this is a line the UFC likes to tell about the first Ultimate Fighter.
Yeah.
Where it peaked at 10 million viewers consecutively. And now that I brought this up, I'm probably going to get it wrong again. But like what actually the stat was I think that there were 10 million people who watched the Griffin Bonner finale fight on The Ultimate Fighter.
Yeah.
Not all at once, but over the course of all of the reruns throughout a week. So there's a 7-day period. The live thing debuted, and I think it had like 2 point some million live viewers average. They average these things out. And then they replayed it throughout the week because, Spike had a pretty thin broadcasting schedule back then. So they did a lot of reruns, especially with original shows. They would play them 3-4 times a week. So I think you get to the 10 million figure by all of the replays. It wasn't like on the night. So I had to like reword that line. But that's again, there's a lot of little things like that where it's just sort of, and stuff like that happens in every side. It's not just the UFC too, but like there's a lot of really convenient statistical shorthand that people use to kind of impose an impression like this was a really big deal.
Yeah.
And that happens a lot with The Ultimate Fighter. It's like this was a really big deal. It changed the whole kind of trajectory of the sport. And it's true, but it's also kind of a distortion because it wasn't that big a deal either. The ratings were between 1 and 2 million viewers per episode on average. Those are numbers they'd kill for now. Like it's shocking to even go back to those days when it's sort of like this brand new cable channel no one had ever heard of, and this brand new kind of series no one had heard of, and this disgraced brand of a sport. And they're still outperforming Conor McGregor's season of Ultimate Fighter now, like even after the company's so much bigger. It's a very peculiar kind of dynamic. But like, even back then, there was a lot of other things going on, in concert with that. And, I still maintain that like the Josh Koscheck, Chris Lieben part of the show, and that was the peak ratings for the whole season. Was the Chris Lieben punching the door and going off to the hospital and like sleeping outside, and like I think they never, until the finale, they didn't get back to that ratings. And I think the finale kind of only matched what the Koscheck Lieben episode had done, at least in terms of average viewership. But then you just get this lore, this myth about what the Bonner Griffin fight was, and it's a fascinating fight. It is an important part of history, but I think kind of does distort the overall perception of why The Ultimate Fighter was important and like what really stuck with audiences. And I think, a little bit of that is because Forrest played along. He was a company man after, and he still works for the company now. He's in the PI Institute, or the Performance Institute. And Chris Lieben, fought for other promotions. He left the UFC, complained a lot. I kind of cited in the book his feels a little bit like he was pushed into the Anderson Silva fight. He felt like he was right there to fight for a title. He'd won 5 consecutive fights. He was a star from The Ultimate Fighter. And, you can make the case that like, he was as accomplished as Nate Quarry and as exciting, as big a draw as he should have been fighting for a title. Would he have, who knows if he would have won? Could he beat Rich Franklin? We'll never find out. But, the fact that they pushed him to take the Anderson Silva fight, and according to him, he didn't get any extra money for it. He just fought for his preset contract. I can't even remember if I put this in the book, but like in his memoir, he writes about Dana visiting him before the fight in his hotel. He gives him the belt buckle
Mm.
that
You didn't
says,
say about a belt buckle. No, you said about him meeting him, I think, and basically pushing him to do it, and then
yeah,
he lost, and then it was just like,
yeah, Dana. As a thank you for taking the fight, even though it was kind of against his best interest, Dana visits him in his hotel room before the fight. I think it was the day of the fight in Vegas. And he gives him a belt buckle that's like, it just basically says I'm an alcoholic or something. Like, I love fighting, fucking, and like not in that order or something, or drinking. Like, it's just, it was like one of those tourist, like, tchotchke belt buckles.
yeah,
And even you can imagine he gets a text from Dana the day of the fight. Hey man, thank you. I want to come up and say hello and thank you for, and this is kind of the era of the envelope bonus checks and the, the under the table payment and stuff. So you can imagine what he's thinking. It's like, oh, they do respect me. Like this, even if I lose, this will be worth it. And it just gets like a $10 belt buckle. He's like, thanks, man. You're awesome. See you later. And then he just gets like, knocked out like from pillar to post in a minute and like never gets close to title contention again. That was his one shot, and he gave up that one shot to help make Anderson Silva a star and to help, the UFC build Anderson, who wasn't popular in the beginning, who wasn't actually a draw. Lieben was probably a bigger draw. In a way, it was kind of self-defeating to use Lieben to push Anderson at that point because Anderson didn't fully get the shine from that moment. Like maybe Lieben versus Franklin would have been, for fans during that period, maybe that would have been a bigger event than Anderson versus Franklin, or at least, it wouldn't have been it wouldn't have been done any worse ratings wise. So yeah, that like, and that it's again, that negotiation that Lieben talks about, his manager at the time was going back and forth. And then you would have Dana would call Lieben directly and go around the manager, which is a huge red flag in almost any industry. It's like when you're like Simon and Schuster didn't call me when they were trying to negotiate the book deal. They were talking to my agent, it's like, don't call me with like, hey man, we really want you to take this number instead of like, I don't know, like maybe, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not like the agent. I don't know what book deals look like. But that's a continuing theme with fighter. Randy Couture talked about, Ronda Rousey talks about it.
Yeah.
It certainly happened with the Diaz brothers. It happens with almost every fighter. And sort of they get the fighters to think like the managers are working against the fighter's interests, and that the fighter would be better off if they just work directly with the UFC. And that in aggregate, that ends up saving the UFC money and hurting the fighters financially.
I wanted to we've been going for a while now. I think it's 20 to 12 here. So I'll do one more question and then we'll wrap it up.
Great.
I wanted to kind of get into the kind of nitty gritty about you as an individual and the process of going through writing the book. And a big thing with writers is about what they call writer's block. When you hit those walls during Cage Kings, I mean, 5 years to write a book is an incredibly long time. What was your kind of go-to method for pushing through? And did you have any kind of like strange habits or rituals that helped you stay on track when you were doing the 2 hours sleep and going again?
No, it's just hell. There's no easy way to do it. It's like I've done a lot of hard things in my life, and I found a new level of difficulty in this. Like it was completely overwhelming. It was just like being buried by information. It's just, I felt like I was in a skit some nights where like I would just imagine like opening a door and then just like an avalanche just completely buries you, like a newspaper cartoon or something. You're just like a finger sticking out from the bottom of a pile. It was brutal. My process for the book was very different from my normal writing process because I come out of web writing. it's so like most working writers now, I think you write for the internet, you write for a website or
Yeah.
blog, or even if it's like, a Tiffany tier, like New Yorker style, most people are writing those pieces for the website. There's less and less revenue coming out of print and more, well, not more and more coming from digital now either. Digital is kind of falling apart, but you know, just the mechanics of web writing are as such that most people are just publishing first drafts. You just do a first draft, a first pass, a first, you're typing and thinking at the same time. And
Yeah.
maybe you do a proofread and you send it, the editor does something to it, maybe send it back, ask some questions, you send it back again. It all happens like relatively quickly. And, there's not a lot of resources for reporting to, that is definitely not. I wound up spending $6,000 report the book, like flying around to California and Vegas and Atlantic City, and we went to Kansas City, a bunch of different places to meet people in person and just talk through, you know, different parts of the history. It's just, a lot of $80 hotel rooms and car rentals and just sad meals at Quiznos in, the middle of central California. And, that was all my own money. I didn't get, you know,
Mm.
I got just enough of an advance from the book publisher to be able to pay that. This was like one of the first times where I had the luxury of not sending just like the first draft and having the first draft be the draft,
Mm.
and that was something I really wanted to do with this book, was like go just make it right. Like, and you know, whatever the book is, however readers find it, whether they like it or dislike it or whatever, the point I got the book to at the end was, this is as good a story as I am capable of making out of this set of facts, this set of resources, set of interviews, this set of information. Like, there's nothing that could have been done better. From like maybe
Yeah.
someone else, another brilliant writer could have come in and made something even better. Not saying there's not a better book out there that couldn't have been written, but like there's nothing I could have done individually as a person to get this book into any better condition. And there's no way to get to that point without just like complete like sacrifice to the point it was like scared. There were points where I'm like, this may never come out because it's just the pieces don't fit. It doesn't make sense. And I was a real gatekeeper on myself, where I was like, I'm not releasing a draft that I have questions about still, that I
Mm.
don't feel good about still. And I was late. I was a couple years late on the contract. But so I did send a first draft as just sort of like, you know, I'm working. This exists in some form. Like, don't think I'm not doing anything. But it was also like, this is very, very much in process. This is like
Yeah.
super fluid. And, I kind of had to sit with what didn't work about it, which is, it's not humiliating. It's discouraging. You just look at your own flaws and failures and like what's not working, and just keep rereading and like, no, that's wrong, that's wrong, no, that doesn't work, and I know I can't say that and I can't do this. And you just live in this world of shit for like years on end in order to kind of scrape the shit away so that the reader doesn't have to deal with that. You end up eating all that shit so the reader can just have like a
Yeah.
clean experience of whatever it is. My only like technique was just like, I gave up any sense of ever being individually gratified by the book. And I think that maybe that was the biggest change, is like, as a first draft writer, as a web writer that's just
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
typing and thinking at the same time, there's a lot of narcissism in that. There's a lot of ego hits in that, where you're like, this is my latest and it's getting all this attention. It's getting all this Twitter feedback or Facebook feed, like whatever the
Mm.
metric at the given time is. All these people are arguing about my little ideas. Like, that makes you feel important. It makes you feel like there's something more at stake in your own kind of thought process and idea process. And that can become a negative kind of spiral. It can
Yeah.
become a very toxic sort of thing. And then, you get in a bad place where you're sort of like, I'm not even sure I believe what I'm writing now. Just sort of like writing in this weird kind of hallucinatory kind of engagement with this phantom audience out there that I think is going to react one way or another. It just like, what am I even saying? Like, I don't even know if. And so for this, I was just sort of like, everything has to be built to last. And a huge part of the process was just forcing myself to be honest about what wasn't built to last in the book, which
Okay.
for about 3 years was just almost everything. It's just like, it was a huge, like, not almost everything, but like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I dramatically restructured the book after the first draft. Like, the reporting was all the reporting. Like I had this avalanche of quotes and anecdotes and stories. It was just
Hmm.
sort of like, and there's so much stuff I love that I had to take out, as an MMA fan and fan of
Yeah.
UFC history. Um, Richard Perez, who's Nick Diaz's boxing coach, and before he was a boxing coach in the 80s. Like, he's one of the most interesting people I think I've met ever,
Hmm.
just in life. Like a strange life he's led, and I had to cut him completely out of the book. But like, I went to his gym, I hung out with him and his wife for, a whole night, saw
Hmm.
him train other fighters. um in the first draft, I gave him like 4,000 words or something. It was told his whole life story. It was just
Mm.
amazing. He was thrown out of his house. He had epilepsy as a kid. His dad was a deeply Catholic immigrant from Mexico who, was kind of superstitious, and he was a pro boxer and had trained his kids to be pro boxers. And Richard hated boxing and didn't like fighting at all. He was really conflict averse, but he had epilepsy, and his father threw him out of the house at 14 because he thought he was possessed by demons. That was like a literal demonic possession. Richard he lived in a motel from 14 to 18, and his mom would go sneak him money so he could pay for the motel room.
Mm.
And the one thing he knew how to do was box. So he worked by being a sparring partner for people. It was the thing he hated, but that his father had trained him to do.
Mm.
And then that went on to become his career. Even as it was his career, he couldn't support himself from it. He worked as a high school janitor up until I think I think it was a Nick GSP fight where he made enough finally to not have to work. It was either the GSP fight or the Conor McGregor Nate Diaz one.
Nice.
He was
Wow.
like, he had world champion boxers he trained in the 80s. He's a high school janitor at the same time. So
Mm.
it's not just the fighters that are sort of like in this deeply precarious position.
Yeah.
Everyone around them, unless you're at the very, very tip top level,
Hmm.
everyone is kind of hustling. And, you know, I had to take that out. That's just
Yeah.
like, but to me personally, I was like, "No, that's the story. That's like the real heart of like what fighting and prize fighting is all about. That's what
Yeah.
connects." And he's from California, very close to where I grew up, so I felt like a real connection to the landscape too. And it was sort of like that's not going in. That doesn't
Yeah.
fit. That's not about the UFC. That's about the wider culture. It's about an interesting person. It's about a UFC fighter's coach. I can't, it doesn't go anywhere that ties back to the story. So like there was a bunch of stuff like that to me was deeply resonant. And I was
Hmm.
just like, so that stuff was painful. Then there was stuff where it's just like, this is boring. This doesn't work. Like
Hmm.
it's like, so it was just like a lot of not being good enough. It's like producing something that hopefully someone somewhere will find meaning in. Like it just, you have to live with your own failures and inability to be good
Yeah.
for long enough that you can finally find those few scraps that are good and kind of weld them together and pass it on, and hopefully other people can
Mm.
go even further in their own directions, their own interests, you know, in like whatever that is.
Yeah. Well, I thought the book was incredible. Anyone that is
Appreciate it.
listening, I think 100% you should go and give it a read. This has been an incredible conversation. I'm going to wrap it up now just because it's getting really late. Thanks so much for sharing your journey and the insights into Cage Kings. I genuinely, I feel like if this was at 8 o'clock in the afternoon, I could just go and go and go. But yeah, just
Yeah,
because
it's late.
I gotta go to bed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
Thank
yeah,
you.
thank
This
you
is
very
a lot
much.
of fun.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Speak to you soon. Bye bye.
All right. Have a good one.